Hello, and welcome back to this episode of the Blue Lineage podcast. On today's episode, we continue to delve deeper into hip hop and how that kind of developed and took shape from, what started off as a movement, cultural movement, and shifted into the industry, became, much more formalized. And, as we've continued to be doing these past episode or two, we're kind of closing out on this soul funk movement that was happening. And to kind of start off with that, kind of wrap that up, our first artist today is Curtis Mayfield. And Curtis Mayfield is he's well known as an R&B, soul, and funk musician with a distinct tenor voice. But even more so, maybe he's known as a composer, and some of the production work he did, which working behind the boards or behind the camera, and really creating work for not only himself but for others, co-writing, composing hits for other people. And he's originally from Chicago. He got his start singing in church choirs in 1957. He was still a teenager. He joined a doo-wop group called the Roosters. He was a guitarist and also did vocals. And that the Roosters was later known as Impressions. That group was led by his friend and longtime collaborator Jerry Butler. And in 1960, he created a publishing company for his music called Curdum. And the Impressions, they had a pretty solid success during that time, during the late 1950s, early 1960s. The band kind of shifted things up over that time as their careers evolved. And they did have a top charting song. It was known as It's Alright during that time period. It came out in 1963. And, while all this was going on, Curtis Mayfield was already starting his composition, songwriting success, writing successful songs for other Chicago-based artists like Major Lance, Gene Chandler, Billy Butler, and Walter Jackson. And as the mid-60s approached, the Impressions began to write more socially conscious lyrics. During that period, he wrote "People Get Ready," "We're a Winner," and some of these songs like "We're a Winner" received a reduced airplay just because of the nature of the song and the social climate. We've kind of talked about this on a number of occasions during that time period, the 1960s into the 1970s, where there was this soul and then also this funk movement that coincided with a lot of the social movements that were going on at the time. In some cases, it was intentionally, not really. It was more made for the black community, and therefore stayed on those R&B charts, which we've talked about, a number of times. Was kind of coded for the black market, and then other times, the artists were just putting out what they could, maybe trying to make a pop song, which is going to sell the most. But due to the social nature of the song, it didn't get as much airplay and whatnot. And even on, an R&B station or some of these other stations, they might get limited airplay just because, of course, just with anything else, when it comes to commercial or business, you don't want to interfere with ad money. And of course, with the radio, it can start to interfere with your ad money if you get too political or unpopular, and so on and so forth. And Choice of Colors is another example. In 1968, he founded Curdum Records, and we already talked about some of his songwriting, but with this venture, he was able to compose and produce film soundtrack albums, including Claudine, which featured Gladys Knight and the Pips, and also featured or helped produce Aretha Franklin's album Sparkle. Uh, and then in 1970, Curtis Mayfield left the Impressions, and he released his debut solo album Curtis that same year. And in 1972, he composed the score for Superfly, which is probably what he, is probably the most well known for and most successful for. Um, so he composed a score for that, and there's commercial success with some of the songs from that album, including "Freddy's Dead," which was based on the character Fat Freddy. There's sometimes people think that because of the timing, and Curtis Mayfield is also from Chicago, that song is related to Fred Hampton. But if you listen to the song, I think it's pretty apparent that it's about a character named Fat Freddy. And Superfly was, of course, I think probably his most well-known hit, this title track of the album and movie. And there's a lot of, I think Curtis Mayfield is a good example of somebody who's kind of associated with that funk era, that funk vibe and culture, but he clearly fits into that soul category and kind of goes along with that movement of the soul movement, Soul Train, this sort of genre that was kind of countering the pop genre, where we saw elements of a lot of these types of music in there. Curtis Mayfield had a lot of funk infused into these songs, but when you listen to his music in general, he definitely, of course, it goes with his background coming from the Impressions. His music dips into that, funk and some of this other new age stuff that was coming out. Some of it definitely has a psychedelic sound at times, but overarching, I think it definitely still fits into that soul R&B genre. And despite the success of Superfly during the 1970s, he continued to work with other artists. That was clearly something that he wanted to do and was passionate about. And he continued to record into the 1980s, and then in 1983, the Impressions had a reunion tour. And then in 1990, he was injured during a concert. It was a crazy freak accident where the stage scaffolding fell on him, and it left him paralyzed from the neck down. And at this point, his health really just declined, from that point on until 1999, when he passed away. Basically all of it kind of going back to those injuries. So, his biggest success was Superfly, but he was still, his big contribution was in the production and composition side. So, with his career ending the way it did, obviously, there could have been more successes, but Superfly is definitely what he's known for. It's a great work of art. The movie, goes together really nice. The movie and soundtrack. That's what is listed on the timeline. The Superfly album. Probably post some of the main tracks from that. But definitely interesting artist. Someone to look into as far as all the different artists and different works that he kind of touched, whether it's through composition or playing on it or singing on the track. Great artist. And that's Curtis Mayfield. Next on the timeline, we go to Sylvia Robinson. And Sylvia Robinson is a very interesting individual on the timeline. I think someone who, I think in the modern era, people don't necessarily know of her as maybe they should. But she had quite a long-spanning career. She was born in New York City as Sylvia Banterpool. She developed an early interest in talent in R&B, and she got discovered by Columbia Records, a Columbia Records talent scout, in high school, and that was when she was 14. And at that point, she worked with a number of labels, during her come up. And Mickey Baker, who was an R&B session guitarist, him and Sylvia formed a musical duo known as Mickey and Sylvia, and they signed with RCA Records in 1956. And they had some success, some commercial success with Love is Strange, who was by Bo Diddley, who was another artist featured on our timeline. And also Baby You're So Fine, There Ought to Be a Law, and for backing vocals, they did backing vocals for Ike and Tina Turner's It's Gonna Work Out Fine. In 1962, Baker left to play in France, and 1964, Sylvia married Joseph Robinson, who became her career manager. He was originally in real estate, and he quit real estate and became Sylvia Robinson's manager. It's always interesting because her individual success, she, of course, becomes famous after she's married, and of course we know her as Sylvia Robinson. And it's always interesting with female artists, especially earlier. Now it's a little bit more of a conversation than a tradition. But when with women changing their name at marriage, of course there was the duo where it was just the two first names. I'm not sure what Sylvia Robinson went as she was coming up before that, if she just went by Sylvia Vanderpool or what. But that's one of the things that sometimes people don't necessarily always consider, is that we see a lot of female artists take on individual, first names, and we see a lot of male artists have like two-part first and last stage names, and that's one of the reasons why. It's just because of the kind of fictional drama that would take place if they got married and they still had the same stage name. It's kind of weird, but it's, I guess, kind of interesting maybe to some people. Anyways, so Sylvia Robinson, she's known as Sylvia Robinson now. She took the name of Joseph Robinson, and for her solo career, they founded a record label called All Platinum, which did have some success with some other artists like Shirley and Company, Shame, Shame, Shame. But Sylvia Robinson was really the best known artist. Her success was definitely the key success on the label. And she had a big song that was kind of a pop disco sounding song called Pillow Talk in 1973. And that song is known, I said disco-esque because it's kind of known as a early form of disco music that would come out later. Disco didn't really become big until the later 1970s. And so if you listen to it, it has a disco sound. We don't really get into disco on this timeline, and it's not like a genre I know a whole lot about as far as the history, but I just know that is something that she's known for. I don't know really what elements and where in formation disco kind of was at this point. I know disco is another one of those kind of labels that describes a kind of a broad set of just sounds kind of compiled, similar to soul. It's not necessarily a standalone genre. It's kind of an amalgamation of some different genres during a time period. But in the late 1970s, the label's success faded, and ultimately they filed for bankruptcy in 1979, which is interesting because 1979 was a big year for hip hop, and Sylvia Robinson and her record company that she then founds. She witnessed hip hop, or what was developing into such hip hop rap at a Harlem World nightclub, and she decided that that's the direction she wanted to go with her music or her record company. So she started a new label, right after this other label apparently went bankrupt, and she called it Sugar Hill Records. And so, along with her and her son Joey, they wanted to recruit talent to sign, and their first talent that they recruited was known as the Sugar Hill Gang. And the Sugar Hill Gang, of course, released The Rapper's Delight, which was the first commercial hit and one of the songs credited in, really popularizing hip hop culture, and certainly a core influence for many, up and coming rappers at the time. And so this is kind of, where you get into a little bit of murky waters. We'll get into some of the more of the foundations of hip hop. But when I think I said last episode, the first commercial or official hip hop was in 1979, and this is what we refer to as this time period. Obviously, hip hop has been in development for a long time, and as we just discussed here, Sylvia Robinson witnesses someone rapping over a track in a club, and so it's already there. This is in New York. This is, of course, where it all got started, and so this is just a marker, 1979, where people can really officially market, because as a commercial success, it's clearly labeled. This is rap, this is hip hop. It's all, we got the numbers, we got the sales. So that's the commercial success and the commercial existence of hip hop, and something that we mark on the timeline as being a first. But as we'll discuss in a little bit, it has really a formation, a kind of a formal formation in the early 1970s. So in that same year, soon after The Rapper's Delight, is another artist we'll talk about, but they signed the Sequence, and she also signed a lot of other top acts, especially in early hip-hop, including Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, who we'll talk about in a later episode. And that group was really the group that expanded the label's creative possibilities, and just really tapped into where the hip-hop movement was going. And Sylvia Robinson, obviously, she has a lot of history, being an artist herself, doing some innovative work in the industry herself, and she wanted to support the rap groups in employing socially conscious lyrics into their music, and taking elements from her own career and own experiences and putting that in it. So she also, besides innovating, kind of putting commercializing, I guess, hip hop to some degree, she also was kind of injecting her experience into some of the artist songs and leading that way as well. But once again, as we kind of saw earlier, they filed for bankruptcy in 1979 with their first label, and in the 1980s, she had some legal matters again with major labels and industry competitors, and a lot of it was just because just the way the format that hip hop or rap comes out, where you're getting into cutting tracks, you're getting into a lot of editing, this and that, and you have to do a lot of clearance, and it became an issue. So some of that, and of course other issues that we'll talk about with some of her signed artists that come up as they go along. But due to that whole experience, she ended up retiring and selling the remainders of the label a little bit while later, after the late 80s. So Sylvia Robinson is just I think a very important, one of the more important individuals on this timeline, I think, but probably one of the lesser known. I could say that about quite a few people, but just because of, the span of her legacy, she, dipped a little bit into disco, and then really uh, built one of the early foundations of the commercial, putting hip hop on the map in the music industry. Obviously, the way it was trending in New York and the interest it was drawing, and the whole phenomenon and culture that was happening, it would have blown up and become successful one way or another. But Sylvia Robinson in that way took the initiative and put together what would be the first group and hit in the hip hop field genre. So that is Sylvia Robinson. So we'll continue to kind of go on this hip hop theme. And so next we'll talk about Clive Campbell, also known as DJ Kool Herc. And so this is where we really get into, the groundwork, the foundation of what later became known as hip hop or rap. And you really see the kind of cultural components come together. And Clive Campbell was originally from Jamaica. He grew up on reggae, Motown, and James Brown, and he also experienced sound system. And one of the things that we talked about earlier, in depth at different times, as far as the contributions of black radio was, number one, just the radio, black radio DJ, and kind of how they kind of shaped that aspect of what would, be part of the hip hop culture, but also how a lot of their radio waves at night were able to cross over to Jamaica, or the Caribbean in general, I should say, because of the more open air at night. And so, a lot of that was passed over, and the music and the DJ and the style was passed over and exposed individuals like, Clive Campbell or somebody to some of these music genres that were occurring up in the States, and it kind of added to what already was going on in Jamaica, or the Caribbean music scenes. And so the sound system aspect kind of adds something different, because that is definitely very much more a Jamaican tradition. And so that's important because when he moved to the Bronx, when his family and him moved to the Bronx later, he kind of recreated these sound system experiences of Jamaica and New York. Kind of saw that in the block parties. And so, so when you think about the Jamaican sound system, and like I just said, it kind of resembles the block parties that Clive Campbell would start in the Bronx, and kind of build up with that whole DJ block party format. The sound systems definitely resemble that, and I think they definitely stand out as a unique example when you compare, where you try to figure out where, that sort of format came from. The sound system definitely resembles that. It's not completely unique, but when you think about the sound system, so the sound system is essentially, I don't know if you've ever seen like a picture or something, a photo of just a ton of like speakers stacked on top of each other, in an outdoor environment. That's basically what sound system was. It was a ton of speakers wired together, and connected to a generator. And so in Jamaica, they would have these sort of mobile remote parties, or events, I guess you could say, just because of the limited access to music. And of course, when you have speakers and a generator, a mic system, a PA system, you're able to pop up, wherever, and was very important for spreading music and, of course, dance, celebration in an area or times where, you know, that was being suppressed or limited. And so, um, yeah, it was for in Jamaica is one of the very few ways to access cultural music, and also to expand and include some of the other music that was coming over from the States, for example. Um, and so, one of the things that that became one of the important themes for hip hop, because not only was Clive Campbell bringing uh, that over to the States, but when you think about the limited portability of music during that time, especially for large gatherings, um, outside of commercial establishments, we've seen, like the sound system, we have seen examples where, when we talked about black radio, DJs, of course, performing in theaters, playing in theaters and whatnot, putting on those type of live parties and shows. Of course, there's music already um, that was already being done with a live DJ. But really, the block party experience, I don't think was fully captured. And of course, being outside of that commercial establishment is a key component too, because when you think about hip hop, hip hop was really formulated and established outside of the commercial environment, and that's why of course, it has kind of building on that soul and funk music, where it's kind of not anti-establishment, but the black community, black culture right now is able to operate and fund and promote music of its own culture. Um, so it's not just black music being played through whatever channels and being sold back to the black community. Now we have, we're producing our own music, through our own channels, and then kind of picking and choosing and able to direct our artists to, sort of a pop, soul, funk, whatever type of music, but it can be created and produced within the community, if so needed or so chosen. And so that kind of continues with hip hop, but of course, with hip hop, it's a little bit even more outside of kind of the norm culture, the way it was developed. And of course, when you listen to early hip hop, a lot of it is, lyrically, a lot of it was very, not necessarily anti-establishment again, but the content was definitely of a different experience that was not necessarily reflected in the mainstream. And of course, people saw that as negative or violent, over-sexualized, the usual labels that kind of minimize, or just you don't really, you can at a face value, you can see why people would feel that way. But also, it was there are important messages to get out, and important experiences to portray and talk about and discuss. And of course, there's just cultural differences sometimes that don't align. Just because you speak the same language doesn't mean you come from the same culture. So that was the portability aspect. There's no CD players. The cassette tape, comes up soon, and that's important for hip hop as well. But you're not able to just have portable power, all of this, and the sound system enables that. You're able to pop up with music. We think of the mixtape era. You're able to essentially cut and develop your own tracks, without a studio, outside the studio. With some of the new technology, you can produce tapes. Maybe you still travel with records, or as a DJ you travel with records. So there's some portable options, but there are obviously limitations, and this era is really the first era where people were able to use a sound system like technology, where you're bringing your speakers, your turntables, your mic and this and that, set up basically wherever, and you need a generator in some cases still, depending where you're at, and just to put together these block parties. And so the key and how it all got started, the block parties got started, is Clive Campbell's sister. Um, she came up with an idea to have a back to school party to raise money for school supplies and such. And Clive Campbell would be playing the music. He was uh, already DJing and whatnot. And so they did this. They rented out the community. What are at their complex? They rented out their community center, whatever they call the little community room. And they put on the first block party, and that became a monthly event. And that's another component, of course, as far as when you think about house parties and the ability for people to kind of have this music outside of commercial establishments. We talked about a little bit with rock and roll and some of the later R&B. And, based on where you're at, obviously, if you're on the outskirts of a city or depending where you're at the city, you might have a house and you can obviously host. Obviously, we live in the suburbs or rural area. It's easier to host larger events in your home. If you live in an urban environment, if you live in like a big apartment complex, obviously there's limitations. Obviously, just living in an urban environment, there's probably gonna be more people trying to get to your party. If you live at a smaller town, you send out invitations and one person brings, their friend or something. That's one thing, but everything just kind of gets magnified in urban areas. So obviously, there's different ways to go about it. But, being outside, having portability to host your party outside, or using one of these community centers, certainly if you're in a really dense neighborhood or something like that, that's another reason and important way all of this was shaped, versus if it help happen somewhere else. So it's always interesting to kind of consider the environment and how that kind of shaped things and may have morphed and pushed the evolution in a certain direction versus another. And that, of course, kind of goes back to the mixtape. The mixtapes is just as far as people being able to pass and how they kind of just, these tapes would move through the community real quick, and you'd hear about this and this, and people would just cut a new track or just make their own tape, and it would just keep getting passed, and the tapes would evolve and really transform pretty quickly. And it's just an interesting, but I think another point to get across is the tapes were not necessarily as big for the black community as they were as a whole, the greater community, because as we kind of discussed, that era kind of had a precedent to release music within the community to the community, and there were programs like Soul Train and whatnot. And so one of the important things that the mixtape provided was we saw some of this music getting outside of the community, and that didn't only give unknown music an opportunity, but it really prevented the censorship of hip hop. Hip hop got a lot of pushback from the mainstream and other groups. I think rap is probably the most lyrically raw of all genres that we've at least discussed this far. And so, having the artist, to the people putting the music out, to have those channels clear to the people listening to the music, to have those channels clear is pretty huge to prevent like the censorship, some of the issues that we've talked about in the past, as far as the radio and music production labels being able to kind of limit and alter songs or deem something inappropriate. Well, it changes everything when you just have people making the music having the ability to basically release it directly to the community. Obviously there's limitations to that. You're not gonna be able to cover as much ground, but once a certain amount of people gravitate to that, or kind of appreciate that music, and it becomes popular within an area, usually, at some point, the industry or whoever someone will be willing to, put that music on a map. Um, so yeah, I keep getting into mixtapes for whatever reason. I'm probably just gonna need to make an episode about it because I think it's just kind of getting me away from the conversation. So DJ Kool Herc, Clive Campbell, he's really credited with developing the concept of the break, using, in this case, using two turntables. You'd play the same record, and you would in this case it would have been like hard funk, just because this is early hip hop, so that's basically the type of record that was going to be used in most cases. And yeah, so you have the two of the same records to kind of extend a specific part of the song, beat or rhythm within the song, so you can focus on that rhythm and groove for an extended period of time, which is really what makes hip hop such a key, party dance oriented music. It's a block party, and the block party kept going for a reason. And of course, the break, more so later down the road, also it provided an opportunity for the DJ to create a foundation for them to work off and add other elements to the beat or bass of the song, or for dancers, of course, for the b-boys and b-girls. And so in 1974, he went from the block parties, which were really popular, and he got his first residency in Havalo nightclub, and that was he did that for a while, but then in 1977, the scene kind of changed for him, and there was an incident that kind of changed his trajectory or how he was going to approach it, and it impacted kind of the early hip hop followers too, when he was attacked at the club, at the Executive Playhouse, after an argument took place, and he was stabbed a bunch of times, and he survived, but that changed the amount of times he performed. But he kind of from that point on, he performed less and less. But he kept going, and really the key is with Clive Campbell is some of the early DJ innovative work that he did, and of course just really bringing the sound system and what was the block party became the block party to the Bronx and to New York, and that really kind of sparked all of hip hop as far as that sort of base foundation, and it kind of just builds up from there as far as people adding lyrics and whatnot, people rapping over tracks, this and that. There were some examples of this we talked about a couple times. Of course, we talked about spoken word. We talked about a couple black DJs back in the day who kind of, it did things that kind of resembled that as well. But of course, at this point, when you have a DJ and you have someone in command of the record, that changes everything. That changes the whole landscape, as we talked about with the break. The break really changes the whole landscape as far as, for the performance, the dance, as well as for, lyrically, kind of opens up that window for, as we'll talk about in a later episode. It just opens up that ability to really edit and make the track your own, and with some of the technology that comes out, very soon as this genre really explodes, that really kind of finalizes everything. It really gives that power to the DJ or the artist to edit and cut or make their own beats and make their own tracks and whatnot, extend, do all of that. And so it's, as we've talked about with previous genres, it's as much as the artist and the ability for the artist to innovate as it is the technology that was being released and created at the time. And so we have one more artist But before we talk about them, we will talk about the terminology on the timeline. And we won't get too deep into it because we've already talked about it when we talked about Jack the Rapper, Joseph Dayton Gibson, and his family affair convention that would happen or used to happen annually. You know, Jack the Rapper, known as Joseph Dayton Gibson, as I just said, he started the convention in 1977, and it was originally for black radio and people involved in the industry to come together and collaborate, exchange knowledge and experiences. It was really the first. It was definitely the first of its kind. As kind of talked about with Jack the Rapper, he was very innovative and progressive on the business side after he kind of finished his DJ and radio direction career. He continued to stay within the business and the culture and kind of be a important political and social commentator. But anyways, this first event was during the first Black Music Month in Atlanta, and the idea was for it to really grow and continue to allow the knowledge base and to have additional seminars and workshops and guest speakers. And it did that to some extent, but also, as many of you might already know, over time it grew and grew and became a little bit less for the conferences and workshops and more for the opportunity to be heard by top industry professionals and just the celebration that it turned out to be, which was really cool in its own right. It's not a knock on the convention. It was definitely a huge phenomenon for the time it was around. And so it really just grew beyond the radio professionals, and you really saw musicians and eventually celebrities, and basically everybody wanted to be involved in the industry, but also just the scene during that weekend, I guess. And so it became basically one of the largest gatherings of its type, and really paired well with the growing hip-hop genre. And the convention, as I kind of alluded to, it became known for performances and just the personalities present at the convention. And the original thinking was Billboard magazine used to have an annual conference as well. And number one, there weren't black professionals who were involved in that really. And so Jack the Rapper wanted to prioritize that, but he wanted the conference to focus more on the educational aspect and, of course, black professionals. And he accomplished that, and of course, a lot more. Definitely served that purpose and a lot more. And Jack the Rapper was very supportive of the growing hip-hop industry. And so that really, his support really also kind of helped that kind of organically grow, and really offered a one of a kind opportunity for these newer labels that were coming up and artists to network and also collaborate with some of the people who've been in the industry for a long time, and some of the legends who may have come up in other genres, but it's all part of the same lineage as we've been talking about. But the other component and thing that was occurring with the growth was the venues, the people hosting the events, people around the event were becoming more concerned, and in some cases rightfully so. It was getting a little bit, there's some raucous that kind of occurred, and so some of it was warranted, but some of it, I think, it was a cultural phenomenon. It was a black cultural phenomenon. So I think sometimes people were just feeling a little bit wary of just the type of people that were coming to it. So some of it was warranted. Some of it was there's certainly some racism in there as well. And of course, hip hop, there's people associated, with hip hop are sometimes so associated with other types of business that has occurred in their past or maybe still occurring. So, it's some of it was warranted, some of it wasn't really. But it was initially hosted in Atlanta, and because of the growth and everything, um, they had to shift to larger alternative venues, and it eventually moved to Orlando, and that was the final um, location. The last convention was 1994. Some fights broke out, and the party just, the aftermath of the party was just too much. It got too much. It was just kind of a mess after it was all over. Besides the fights and everything, it's just a lot going on, and so that was kind of it. And we kind of went to some of the other details about some of the things that kind of went around that had to do a little bit more with Jack the Rapper. But that's, in a nutshell, that is the family affair. Jack the Rapper's family affair. And so, yeah, if you want to find out more, I would recommend going back to that clip or that episode with Jack the Rapper. I don't know what episode it was off the top of my head, but certainly if you go to the timeline at BlueLineage.com, you can at least look at the clip, and it should go into it to some degree. And I think that there may be a clip about the family affair, but I don't remember. We'll have to see. So the last artist on the timeline, or artists, actually, I should say, are the Sequence. And I briefly mentioned the Sequence when talking about Sylvia Robinson and Sugar Hill Records. And the Sequence was known as one of the first all-female hip-hop groups to sign with the label. And, perhaps like one of the first commercial hip-hop groups ever, if you consider that, the Sugar Hill Gang was formed by, Sylvia Robinson and Sugar Hill Records. They kind of scouted out these individuals, whereas the Sequence, they already existed, as a group. So you could say that they may have been one of the first commercial hip-hop groups in general, just by how long they've been together, but not the first signed. So the group was composed of Angie Stone, at the time known as Angie Brown, and she was a R&B singer. You may have be familiar with her already, but at the time of the Sequence, she was known as MC Angie Brown. And the other group members were Cheryl the Pearl Cook and Gwendolyn MC Blondie Chisholm. And so, as I was saying, they had met in high school. They formed a group in high school in Columbia, South Carolina. And as the story goes, they met with Sylvia Robinson backstage, so they kind of found a way to get backstage, and they were able to, it was during a Sugar Hill Gang show, and they were able to perform for Sylvia Robinson and them, and she was impressed, and they were signed. And their first single was Funk You Up, which was released in 1979, and of course, this would have been the third rap single to make it to the top 50, and all of this was, of course, all in the same year. 1979 was a big year for Sugar Hill Records and hip-hop, commercially at least. This was the third rap single to make it to the top 50 of the Billboard Hot Soul Singles, which is what that was called at the time. You can go back to our episode about the history of the Billboard charts to learn a little bit more about that and the naming process. And this was the second release from Sugar Hill Records and the first by an all-female rap group commercially. Always have to add that piece in. And they were a very interesting and innovative group, I think, just because they combined their R&B roots. They're originally really an R&B group with funk and rap, and really in many ways foreshadow the aspects of the genre. Going to the future, as we saw, rap or hip hop develop. We saw a little bit more of the combinations that we saw as far as combining some of these vocal aspects with some rapping and some other if you think of some later groups that kind of really put it all together. We saw that more down the line, but being the first, really one of the first groups to already be doing that and already to have that in their albums, was pretty interesting and innovative. And so yeah, their first album and their second album, they had a moderate success, but it was limited, and they definitely had a good notoriety, but the financial piece was always an issue. Compared to their pioneers and innovators within the genre. Obviously, Sugar Hill Records being one of the first to produce these commercial rap groups, they were obviously seeing some good financial success. But we talked about one aspect where there's some lawsuits later down the line that they were dealing with, Sugar Hill Records. But at the same time, the record company itself, they owned the Sequence's publishing rights for 30 years. So the members of the Sequence, they didn't gain their rights to their music until 2016, basically. So that's that's very recent. So it's unfortunate. That aspect is unfortunate because we are now seeing some of these black performers really coming through their career, maybe early in their career having to deal with the industry and not being paid fairly, and now they're starting their own companies and really having the opportunity to try to right some of that. And I know to some degree a lot of things were righted. Jack the Rapper, as I talked about, is a good example of someone who kind of was critical of this pattern that was occurring. So it's unfortunate that artists like the Sequence were, even though they were their boss, was someone who went through the industry themselves and kind of saw the good and the bad, is now kind of continuing to do that to them. And being a group in 1979 and not getting your publishing rights till 2016, it's quite a span of time right there where you could probably have used those finances. But that's really the Sequence, a very pioneering genre. Pioneers in the genre, very important. I think one of the reasons they're highlighted is because of their unique style, kind of innovating not only as a premier, first group in commercial hip hop, but also just their style. When you listen to their style, it's very, it sounds more modern, I would say, to some degree, as far as the way they kind of blend R&B and hip hop. And I think another aspect for a lot of this is just when you think about Sylvia Robinson and the Sequence, and a ton of these early groups. We'll talk about another group, but just females in hip hop. I think a lot of times people, the hardcore hip hop fans know about it, and there of course is a lack of females throughout the industry, certainly even more so on the production side. But I think sometimes people think of the more recent women rappers or hip hop artists as kind of a change in the genre, but you also, I think, have to recognize, and a lot of people do recognize, some of these early artists, female artists, who really got the genre going. This is the very beginning of hip hop, like the very beginning of commercial hip hop. So, to be there right in the beginning and to kind of set that precedent, I think it's very important to recognize a group like the Sequence, and kind of also just see that lineage with how Sylvia Robinson kind of did what she did as far as bringing that into the spotlight to have her career, and then essentially become the CEO of the first major commercial hip hop label. So that's the sequence. We'll have those tracks up on the site, and very good to check out. Great group in their own right, not necessarily super well known, but of course I think Angie Stone may be known more for her R&B career sometimes than her time with the sequence. But I don't know. I think it just depends. What you kind of came up, what you grew up with, or what genre you're into, and what history you know of. I know a lot of people, will be in like to old school and not necessarily hip hop. I know, like, even though they're so related, it's a lot of times it's a different crowd, so it kind of depends on what you listen to. But anyways, that's this episode. Basically at this point we have one more episode, and we're just gonna be basically wrapping up this hip hop genre with a couple more important artists. Really kind of just developing. We just got into the beginnings of it, and now it's definitely formally hip hop. We saw how Clive Campbell and that community kind of formalized it all and laid the groundwork for DJs to really take off and run with it and innovate more as far as with the break and how you want to shape tracks and utilize records and turntables. And of course we talked about cassette tapes and how that you're able to record to a cassette tape and essentially make your own music in this way. And then we'll talk about another invention that's very important in this process, and some artists that were really kind of starting to innovate and take the actual lyrical style and the music into what resembles more of the hip hop and rap today. And from there, we'll talk about it next episode. But by no means, being the last episode, does that mean that that's the end of musical innovation. Plenty of innovation that's happening, now and since the end of the timeline. We'll talk about why it ends. It ended, or ends when it does, next episode. But thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking around with the Blue Lineage. Hopefully it's kind of taken shape. I think this episode was a little bit choppy, especially with the Clive Campbell trying to talk about mixtapes. But like I said, I'll probably have to do a separate episode just on that and try to clarify some of those things, because it was kind of all over the place there. But we're into hip hop. We're almost there. Thanks for listening again, and take care.